For example, last week I went to an award show in New York City that was celebrating some of the early work being done in 100% AI generated television commercial production. And yeah, look, the trained eye could definitely recognize that these ads were created by AI, but that's today, and that was May of 2026. By, I would imagine, by September of this year, those tells will be gone, and that will upend an entire commercial production industry. And so nobody really knows what it's going to look like, and what people's roles that were one thing before and what they're going to look like, in the future. I think everybody has this feeling like, oh, well, it's going to get rid of people's jobs. I, you know, I I think it's silly to say that that is not going to happen. I'm sure it is going to happen. I just don't know whether it's going to happen at a sort of mass, every single person in the industry, catastrophic scale. But you got to lean into these changes. There's not leaning away from them or resisting them is not going to do anything. You are not going to slow down the coming of these technologies. So you might as well, lean into them and ask the question, what's next? Be open to not knowing, and learning every day.
Have you ever faced a moment that changed everything? A loss, a new path, or an awakening that forced you to rewrite your life? Pivot Point is a podcast that explores those stories. I'm Nik Michael. We'll dive into how pain can spark growth and how crisis leads to clarity. Subscribe to Pivot Point today.
Hey.
Welcome to Pivot Point, Strategy for Change. I'm Nik Michael. Most of us don't arrive at change. Change arrives at us. A moment of friction, a quiet unease, or sometimes something louder that makes it impossible to keep moving in the same direction. And what I find interesting isn't the change itself, but everything that happens just before it. The resistance, the rationalizing, the way we negotiate with ourselves when we sense something needs to shift, but we're not quite ready to let it. That's what this is about. Not pivot points as a metaphor, but as a lived experience. The place where awareness meets action, where what you've known runs up against what's becoming necessary. Whether that's in your work, your relationships, your sense of who you are, or all of it at once. As a clinician, I've spent a long time sitting with people in exactly those moments. What I've learned is that change isn't really the hard part. The hard part is being honest enough with yourself to see that it's already happening. So let's start there. Today's conversation is one I think will resonate with a lot of you. Whether you're early in your career, well into it, or sitting with that quiet restlessness that's hard to explain, but even harder to ignore. My guest today is Jason Kuperman. Jason is a veteran growth executive, fractional chief marketing officer, and go-to market advisor based in the greater New York City area. With over 25 years of experience leading modern marketing and product experience teams at large enterprises. But before we talk about where he is now, it's worth understanding where he started, because that's really what Pivot Point is all about. Jason began his career at the office of Frank Gehry, learning to design and build things that were complex, ambitious, and structurally sound. He was an architect, not just by training, but by identity. And then, over time, something shifted. Not a dramatic break, but a clear and honest realization. He loved architecture as a passion, but not as the life he wanted to live every day. And instead of staying the course, simply because he had invested so much in it, he made the decision to pivot. What followed is a career that mirrors the evolution of the digital age itself. Jason specializes in building high-velocity growth engines, modern data ecosystems, and agentic AI workflows. holding a master's in architecture from the University of Colorado, Denver. He approaches business optimization through a unique lens, treating corporate organizational design, workflows, and talent development as architectures that dictate human behavior. He built TBWA Shiat Day's first digital division, leading early digital work for Apple. He scaled operations across 16 markets in Asia Pacific for Omnicom Group. He led the go-to market strategy behind Outfront, media's multi-billion-dollar industry transformation. And today, he runs Kuperman Advisors, where he works as a fractional CMO, helping B2B founders build marketing strategies that stand up to real-world pressure from investors, boards, and the kinds of decisions you can't easily undo. But what we are really exploring today goes beyond titles and milestones. It's about the internal shift, the moment you recognize something needs to change, and the courage it takes to follow that realization through. I'm very excited to have the guest I have today, Jason Kuperman. Jason, welcome to Pivot Point.
Thank you for having me.
Today, I'd love to hear about a pivot point in your life that feels significant to you, a moment or period when something shifted, when you recognized that change was necessary, or when you made a decision that altered your path in a meaningful way. As we talk through your experience, know that we can explore as much or as little as feels right to you. And if there are other pivot points in your story, other moments of transition or transformation that you'd be open to discussing, I welcome the opportunity to have you back in the future for another conversation. But the work you do, the insights you carry, and the challenges you've navigated are exactly the kind of experiences that can help others who might be standing at their own crossroads. So, Jason, tell us, what pivot point would you like to share with listeners today?
My pivot point, the biggest pivot point I had, happened very early on in my career. I went to school after I graduated college. I went and got a master's degree in architecture and was on the path to become an architect and have a full career of architecture. I was in the field for about 2 years, and I realized that I was very passionate about architecture itself, but I was not excited about being an architect for a living. And went through a lot of introspection and had a couple of experiences that made me realize there was it wasn't just that I did not want to do architecture. I was also drawn to something else, which I think made it a lot easier to make the decision to leave. It wasn't just I was unhappy. I was also excited about something else. This was in the late 1990s, and the internet was sort of making its mark on the world, and it made its mark on architecture. And I was drawn to that.
I love stories like that. I made a transition myself from the business field to what I do now as a clinician. I'm always curious about back then when the thought came to mind, or was it an emotion that came to mind? It came to your body. What
Right.
was the experience really that you became aware first? Yeah, I'm curious.
It's a funny story. It was actually a project I was working on. The firm I was at had a large university library we were designing in New Zealand, and the librarians were in town. I was working in Los Angeles. The librarians were in town to review the first set of design concepts we had, and I'll never forget the head librarian accused us of finding a library like it was a place to store and share books, and that she really saw them as a place to store and share information. And we all sort of were like, well, what do you mean by that? And she said, well, in today's world, information travels through the internet, and the way that people interact with that information is through computers. And the partner in the firm leaned over and pointed to the model and said, no, look, this little area here is for computers, for the card catalogs, which, have all been replaced by technology. And she said, no, that's really not what I mean. What I mean is that, people will be coming into the library to not use a reading room the way it used to be, but in the sense that it's an information commons where they're going to come in and may have books, but they'll have computers, they'll want access to the internet. And that really needs to change the fundamental way that libraries are designed and the spaces that are designed. And everyone sort of nodded their head and was very thoughtful, and the meeting ended. And after that, the partner turned to me and was like, Kuperman, you've got 2 weeks, come back to me with a full overview of what this internet thing is, what it's going to do to our business, to our design, to the world. And I went off, I did that research, and there were a million implications for architecture. And ultimately, I decided that, after that deep dive into looking at what the internet was and what it could do for business, design, people, I said that's really what I want to do, and started looking for jobs in that space, and eventually ended up at an advertising agency beginning as sort of employee number one of their digital advertising group, and have been in that new media space for more than 25 years.
My goodness. I was so struck by your story when you had brought that up. I'm curious now about how you invested years of your education and part of your early career in architecture, because completing an architecture degree does not usually end in only 4 years, from what I understand.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
pretty
no,
extensive,
yeah,
right?
it
Yeah.
was a long haul. It was a lot of work. It was a great experience. But yeah, there was a lot of emotions involved in deciding that I was going to kind of put that aside and move on to something else. Ultimately, it's not just the narrative that I told myself. I think it's more ultimately what I really found out about it was that there were so many similarities. So if you think about architecture, on one hand, you were looking at these convergences of technology and design and how people use space and how they move through space in ways that were clear to them and they could get value out of their experience in a building. And, back when I started working in digital marketing, people were building their first websites. That was sort of job one. And the similarities were there too. It was about design and technology sort of coming together, and the spaces needed to be, the websites needed to be clear to people. It needed to be clear what value you could get out of it, how to move around it. So I found all these similarities that made me feel like, yeah, I might have been leaving architecture as it meant building physical buildings, but there were enough similarities to the components and elements that comprised what good architecture was and what made good websites, that it felt very much like I was sort of moving into a cousin of architecture instead of leaving it completely. And that made the transition a little easier.
So I got my first webpage in 1999 when I worked at the hospital, and it was for my own private practice. And all the doctors who were part of the faculty practice when they worked at the hospital, they had their billing done and they were working part of the hospital. I was private outside. So they were very like shocked to hear that
You had
people who get web pages are hardware stores, or people who are in the service, more like industry. But you built a career through an era when digital was new. It was disruptive and it was largely undefined. And I'm going to go into this now because Gen Z is entering a moment where AI is doing the same thing. What do you think is actually transferable from your experience to theirs?
well,
Is it?
yeah, I do think there is. I'll give it through the lenses of my experiences in
Yeah.
advertising specifically, but I think I think it's not just in the marketing and advertising industry. I think it's in general. I read an interview with a creative director, somebody I had actually worked with a long time ago, who said he'd been in advertising in 30 years and he'd been hearing that it's the end of advertising for 30 years. Right. And, new technology always comes and disrupts the way things were, and they shift around and change, and things don't quite look different. Things don't quite look the same as they did before. But there's still an industry there. It just may be in a different form. And I think AI is doing similar things. I think it's disrupting a lot of industries, just like all technologies do. Brand, generating awareness, all that stuff is still going to be there. It's just the mechanisms and tools that are used to do it will be different.
I hear you. I hear you. I'm. We're all at a crossroads right now with all of that, and where we see things happening with AI. But I want to get back to you and the switch you made, because that was significant for you. I know you mentioned that staying on the architecture track would have been easier in the short run, but more costly long term. What does a costly mistake look like to you? What would the real price have been?
Yeah, that's a great question. I grew up. I went to preparatory school, so I spent my youth preparing to go to college,
Right.
and it was everything was all about like what's next. And I think that was probably the hardest part, was instead of making a decision to stick with something that I understood the track, I would continue to be, there's a rigorous testing process for architecture. There's a clear hierarchy. You sort of apprentice and move and grow. It's all planned out for you. And there was something that was very, very appealing to that and enticing. It was difficult to leave that to something that I had no idea what it was going to be. I mean, I certainly wasn't one of the people who thought, oh, the internet's a fad, but there were certainly a lot of them. And I was hearing from all of them, like, oh, why would you trade? Why would you leave a trade like architecture that's been around for centuries and will always be here, to something that is, this flash in a pan?
So they thought.
So they thought. Exactly, exactly. So I think, the costly decision, sticking with what's familiar, sticking with what's comfortable, and not allowing yourself to grow. And that is something that I was, remember being very clear about at the time, is that the manifestation of what this was going to be, this unplanned life that I now all of a sudden was facing, compared to what was going to be a planned life. That was part of the experience that I needed to go through, and I needed to learn how to tackle that challenge and mold that clay into something. And that was a more important life lesson than sticking with what I had done in the past, which was, year one leads to year two, all this
Yeah.
connection of one to two to three. And that is something that an experience I had that has stuck with me. Decades later, when I met my wife, she decided that she was really interested in moving to Asia. And at a certain point in our lives, we decided to up and move from a comfortable life in Venice Beach and move to China. And that was the same thing. Was like I knew I had knew what our life was like where we were, because we had built it up, and it had a very natural progressive sense to it, and that I was excited to roll the dice and try something new that I couldn't really imagine what it was going to be like. And those were formative experiences.
I love hearing how when someone finds the right partner and somehow they feel inspired by their urge and aligned by their vision, that they could move together. So that's an amazing experience. So you landed at TBWA Shiat
Chiat, yeah, yeah.
Shiat, yeah. So what was it like working with them? And you did a lot of work, and then you moved on to several other companies. How did it sounds like it's been ingrained in you to really, like, you're hardwired, it seems, like a hardware compared to software, to adapt and be willing to step into the unknown and the emotions that are involved in that. What were they going into all that? What was it like back then for you
Yeah. So,
emotionally?
it was a very interesting time to be at Chiat in Los Angeles. Chiat was one of the seminal agencies, in the last 30, 40 years of advertising, founded by Jay Chiat, who created this saying, he'd rather be the pirates than the Navy, and worked. Jay Chiat and Lee Cloud, the creative director there, worked closely with Steve Jobs when Apple was, they did the 1984 commercial. They were there
Now
at
you
the
worked on
beginning.
those campaigns, from what I understood, right? The Apple.
So I wasn't there then in 1984, but as Steve Jobs left Apple and went off and did other things, and Scully from Pepsi came in, and eventually Jobs came back to Apple, and
Yeah.
Apple came back to Chiat, and they did this
Yes. Yeah.
different campaign. And yeah, no, it was an amazing experience. I built a team. We presented the first banner ads to Steve Jobs, for the iPod Shuffle that they had done when they started to look at digital media. These were absolutely amazing experiences, and Chiat was a really fantastic culture because of what the culture that had been defined for it when it was a private company. At the time I was there, they had been acquired by a large holding group and were in the process of becoming part of a global network and going down the road, which, most large agencies are today, which is they're big businesses that have to, report results to Wall Street, and have a much different, culture. But at Chiat, it was, at the time that I was there, it was still an intense culture of creativity, and was based around this concept of the global chairman, a Frenchman named Jean-Marie Drew, who wrote a book called Disruption, which was that if you're going to succeed and stand out, you need to understand what the conventions of your industry are, understand what's valuable about those conventions and what's limiting about those conventions, have a vision that will take you beyond them and introduce a disruption to the industry that allows you to achieve that vision. And that has been hardwired into me, for sure. So it was a great experience.
When you look back at that early transition period, is there a decision that you almost didn't make, one where you nearly talked yourself out of it?
I was talking myself out of the decision to move to China.
Okay.
Every day I was talking myself in and out of it. And ultimately, I think it is really only change that I think change fuels progress, and it's, I just continually came back to the same decision, which is, do I like the track I'm on now? Is it worth the comfort of the track? Is it worth where the track is leading me? Or do I want to try and create a more valuable growth experience by changing tracks and doing something different and experiencing something different?
You made this shift from thinking about your career as a track to thinking about it as a journey. I like the way you have always put that. What does that actually change in how you make decisions day to day? Because it's a journey, you're saying.
Yeah, no, it's true.
And I think that's an important thing for young people to consider now, because so much is changing. They have a different outlook. And I know I want to get a little bit more into Gen Z, but I want to talk about
Yeah,
your story.
I think it, even for myself, as I tell these stories, I probably come off as sounding very brave, but the truth is,
You do.
yeah, yeah, well,
It is brave.
the truth is I'm highlighting the points where I was brave enough to make big decisions, but there are hundreds of other decisions that I make from a safety mindset as opposed to an adventure mindset. And, some of those are good and some of those are bad. There are times where, look, it really makes sense for me to stay on track. I'll give you a very personal example. When we moved to Asia, I was working at Omnicom Group at the time, the holding company of these advertising agencies, and we had one child, and we were seriously looking at having a second child, and I had a career opportunity to move back to the US. And at that point in time, the idea of having another kid, moving back to the US, and having those two changes happen at once was
Mm.
too much. That was like that was something that I backed away from, and we decided, what, we're going to stay here and have our second kid. And so sometimes it's the right decision to shake things up, and sometimes you need to
No,
know
very
you're in
well
a
put.
place.
And I
Yeah.
think that's a tough situation for many young people. I know you scaled across 16 markets in Asia Pacific for Omnicom, and then you led a $3.2 billion digital transformation at Outfront Media. I know each of those chapters required a different version of you. How did you know when to evolve?
Well, working in Asia, it was a great team of folks at Omnicom, and there was one approach that we took as a holding company, which was all of our agencies are different, and we need to look at the world through the lenses of our different agencies. And that was an important lesson around perspective, working across different countries and regions. So I think in Asia, it was a great exposure to different cultures, the way different cultures reacted to brands, and what, down to the point of like what colors meant different things in different countries. And and working with global brands that were trying to communicate around central messages but had to create variations for audiences in the Middle East versus audiences in South Asia, and things like that. So that
This all
that was,
sounds very exciting, by the way. So
yeah, yeah, it was. That was great. Coming back to the US and joining a startup that was focused on display technology and taking digital advertising approaches to physical advertising in the out-of-home industry. You mentioned the big transformation at the MTA. That was super exciting. I grew up in New York City, rode the subway, was very familiar with the vinyl ads and cardboard ads that were all over the subway.
yeah.
And to have the opportunity to pitch and ultimately win the digital transformation of that ad inventory was really one of the most exciting things, ever. Coming up in the ad agency world, I had thought that I had done big pitches. We had pitched the Visa and the Olympics. We had done these big presentations that felt like the biggest things ever, but they were all tiny compared to the work we did to win the MTA, both in how much effort and energy it took, and the rigor and the process, and ultimately the size of the prize.
Wow. Now, your current work at Kuperman Advisors involves helping founders tell a marketing story that holds up under pressure. Where does the architecture training show up in that work? Is it conscious or otherwise?
It's very conscious. I mean, one of the things that I've done in the last 6 months is, having left enterprise marketing, I've been working with smaller companies, mostly in the B2B space, and amazed really at how many of them overlook playbooks and basic fundamentals and foundations of marketing and marketing operations. And I draw the analogy to architecture. Every building design was an opportunity to create a sense of expression and a little bit of art, and something that generates value both visually and from whatever the function of the building is for the community. But they all work on principles of physics and gravity and things like that, and plumbing and electrical. And you can't just start designing artistically without those fundamentals, without an understanding of those sort of literal foundational elements. And that's what I'm doing a lot now, is helping businesses sort of build the foundational components of their marketing and their marketing organizations in a shifting time frame, in a shifting time in the business. As we were talking about, Gen Z is not the only one wrestling with AI. Everybody's trying to figure
Yeah.
it out, and marketing is definitely being affected by AI. And it's changed what your marketing organization looks like and what you do. And so that's really where my focus is today.
Now, I can clearly see that, and I can imagine your clients are fortunate to be working with you, given the background you come from. Your architecture background, the things you've done over the years, really the journey that you've entered, and the risk you've taken. I mean, it's risk no matter what, wherever you go. And the changes that you've made, I'm sure you really command the room when they come in, because you have the stories you have. It's just fascinating to hear. You're talking about things that you were right there in the room. And you work with companies at a point of real transition, raises, rebuilds, scale ups. What's the most common internal struggle you see founders carrying into those moments that they're not naming out loud?
I've seen almost every founder that I've worked with could 100% run the business themselves. Like, they're
Mm,
all that great. They're all that smart. They could make every sale. They could put every marketing, concepts together. They could do all that from a talent perspective, but you can't grow a business that way around one person. So, I would say that's sort of the most common thing, is getting a founder to let go a little bit, to find people that share their vision and can internalize it and then externalize it and articulate it in a way that may not be exactly the way the founder would do it, but it's close enough that it's on, on brand, on vision, and sort of see that grow beyond themselves. And that translates into almost every decision that needs to be made, from how the business is structured, how they do, certainly their marketing, their sales, and even the operations of the business.
You're listening to Pivot Point Strategy for Change. If today's conversation resonated with you, take a moment to subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. It truly helps others find the show and supports the work we're doing here. Yeah, you're talking about dealing with a person who has control issues.
Yeah, sometimes it's control issues. Yeah.
And is concerned about giving up the pilot seat to someone else and delegating when they might be, to a point, they might be small enough to be able to oversee everything, and, delegating instead of implementing it themselves. You mentioned
Delegating, it's interesting. I think specifically with some founders, not certainly not everybody, but I have seen that it's sometimes they will delegate or allow others to take over these things, and it's almost like in the back of their mind they're hoping they fail because it sort of justifies their own value,
Yeah.
and it's sort of like, well, I knew I should have kept doing it, and they don't understand that that's part of the process. Like, of course, no one's going to get it right off the bat. Like that's some of the pain here. You're not just delegating it because it's going to be great. You're delegating it because you need to focus on other things, and
Well,
people
yeah.
need to learn how to fail and
And
continue
there's
to work to
exactly.
get it right.
And there's an opportunity cost that they have in order to do something else instead of keep doing what, and overseeing everything. Earlier, I like the word you said, what's next? You mentioned the question, you're still living into simply what's next, which I find fascinating given how much you've already built. What does that openness feel like from the inside?
It's always a little frightening.
Yeah.
It's definitely always a little frightening, but the more I speak to people who I would imagine know what's next and are very focused on what's next, I realize that what's next is always just an opinion in most cases. So it may be frightening, and I think just people are do a better job of exuding confidence around what's next. But these days, just for example, last week I went to an award show in New York City that was celebrating some of the early work being done in 100% AI generated television commercial production. And yeah, look, the trained eye could definitely recognize that these ads were created by AI, but that's today, and that was May of 2026. I would imagine by September of this year, those tells will be gone, and that will upend an entire commercial production industry. And so nobody really knows what it's going to look like, and what people's roles that were one thing before and what they're going to look like, in the future. I think everybody has this feeling like, oh, well, it's going to get rid of people's jobs. I, you know, I think it's silly to say that is not going to happen. I'm sure it is going to happen. I just don't know whether it's going to happen at a sort of mass, every single person in the industry, catastrophic scale. But you got to lean into these changes. There's nothing leaning away from them or resisting them is not going to do anything. You are not going to slow down the coming of these technologies. So you might as well, lean into them and ask the question, what's next? Be open to not knowing and learning every day.
So well said. You said it's great to have a long-term plan as long as you stop periodically and evaluate whether the destination still has value. How often do you actually do that? And what does that check-in look like for you? You've had long-term plans. I mean, at different stages, we all have. You've made some major changes at different stages and decisions. And you seem to be someone who thinks through and really takes their time. You don't come from an impulsive type of, I'm just going to go and, so you take your time.
Yeah, I think it's definitely pros and cons. I've many times with my partner, gotten an easel, put paper on it, created 2 columns, did pros and cons, done sort of a more an analytical approach to it. But it, it definitely starts with where you're looking to go, understanding that destination, and then really evaluating whether you're continuing on that path because you made a decision to, and you've committed to it, and it's you have a comfortable plan, and you reassess whether that's still the same destination that you're looking to get to. And sometimes you may still want to get there, but be faced with the reality that your path isn't going to take you there. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, you just have to shift things around.
What's different, I hear you explain in getting to know you in this time, is that you're coming from a perspective of, it's essentially of a growth mindset, embracing and understanding whether or not I've made a mistake, or if it's not a mistake, now it's time to change course. And you're open to hearing that. Many people will keep the blinders on in order to avoid that because they don't want to touch upon and recognize, and which is where I come back
Yeah.
to here, the emotional impact of something that causes a cognitive reaction. And then I don't want to act.
Yeah.
I want to stay. Now that's a decision to stay, but they're not acting they're ignoring. And I talk to people
Right.
whose bodies break down. They had no illness, but so.
Yeah, I mean, look, for me, I'm one of these people who have no problem sort of reflecting on my own mistakes and shortcomings and things like that. But I am super guilty of being fearful of the messy. And there are definitely times where I've got a plan and I'm stubborn about sticking to it because the alternative is undefined and messy and
Yes.
anxiety ridden. And I will definitely avoid that. But at a certain point, you know, the craziness of the plan
Hmm.
that may feel comfortable overwhelms the fear and the anxiety of shifting from the plan.
So,
And that you have to be sensitive to and listen to.
right. So I'm curious for you, and I'm trying to understand the process while it's happening. I wonder how fully aware and how much do you acknowledge the emotional, the physical signs, and it doesn't seem right, the cognitive signs. And then how long do you take, or do you give yourself, while you ignore those signs, while you stubbornly or obsessively follow the plan that may not be working? And I know it's different in every occasion, right? You're going to say it
Yeah,
depends.
sure.
So
Look,
we all have our matter. Well, how long are we going to keep ignoring? Let's just say a pain. Someone has a pain in their body. How am I going to keep ignoring this? And when will I finally change paths?
yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have a clever answer
Are you
for like
aware of it
when
as it
that magic,
happens?
when
Yeah.
that magic
Are you
moment is. I
are
just
you
know,
aware of?
yeah, I mean, I guess I know, I'm sure a lot of people can sort of share and empathize with this perspective. The pandemic put a hold on certain decisions that I had because
Right.
the experience was so exhausting that I sort of forgave myself for not being brave or making changes or being willing to do things. I sort of tolerated unhappiness. I tolerated these things because I was exhausted. I felt absolutely, emotionally exhausted by having gone through this. And, when people ask me about my, any regrets in my recent history, I regret those decisions. I regret the decisions that I allowed the pandemic to excuse, me not making.
Well, that's important to be aware of, and I'm glad you brought that up. What you're saying, it's very difficult in the moment to recognize that and to know each time. So I appreciate the honesty and
Yeah,
being
and I
aware of
think
it.
it's also very easy to make excuses for yourself because
Absolutely.
a lot of the excuses are legitimate.
Yes.
You know what I mean? They're not. You're not being an idiot. Like
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
in the right perspective, and sometimes they let it be too dominating and drive their behavior. And I'm certainly guilty of that.
I hear you. I was going to ask you a little bit about Gen Z. I know you work with
Let's talk
different
about
age ranges. Gen Z has grown up with an enormous amount of information about what careers could look like, but also a lot of anxiety about making the wrong choice early. You pivoted out of a field you trained for. What would you say to someone in their mid 20s who's already feeling like they're on the wrong track?
First, I think you have to be forgiven. I think you have to be forgiving to yourself.
To yourself.
Along the way, the decisions you made that got you there, you were basing your decisions based on what you knew at the time. And if the world has changed around you, or you as a person has grown and your perspectives on what you enjoy and what you don't enjoy have changed, that is all okay. That is absolutely okay. So I think that's the very first thing. And look, I have a 16-year-old right now who's very interested and excited and planning a future around certain things. And it's hard as a parent to know, I like that. I think that's good. I think you're driven and focused. But on the same end, I want you to feel like if you all of a sudden get exposed to something else that's more interesting, you need to have the space to entertain those things as well. So, I think that's really important especially for Gen Z, to understand that they're growing up in a world that is changing quickly, and they can only make the decisions based on what they see making an impression on them today, and react to that and figure out what to do. And that in 5 years from now, that may change based on who they are and based on what the world around them.
You're listening to Pivot Point Strategy for Change. If today's conversation resonated with you, take a moment to subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. It truly helps others find the show and supports the work we're doing here. You can find Pivot Point Strategy for Change on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like a deeper dive into the work we explore on the show, I invite you to visit my Substack page, where I share in-depth articles and reflections. Now, well said. I appreciate hearing that. You talk about career as a journey rather than a track. Gen Z often gets described as anti-hustle or skeptical of the grind culture. We're from the grind culture, I imagine. Do you think that's a problem, or do you think they're identifying something that earlier generations missed? Because they're very critical of previous generations and how we worked or are working. Are they onto something?
I think they are.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think they are. I think that the ideas of
That's encouraging for them.
yeah. I mean,
No,
I
want
think
you to be open. Yeah.
yeah, I think I read a lot of articles around the idea of the definition of work changing. It was like joining part of a family. The company was this institution that they were a part of, and I don't think that exists anymore. I don't think companies look at employees as their family necessarily anymore. So I think just the nature of work has changed over the years, and what companies still sort of ask of people feels a little out of date. It advantages the companies. So I do think Gen Z is wise to that. I do think they sort of get that. I think the challenge is that they may not always know what to do with it. I don't think they have the maturity and experience yet to take that insight and that perception and say, this is how I should behave now in a way that is productive for everybody involved and for building my career. That's where I think the issue is.
This brings me to the next question I was going to flash up on the screen. There are big misconceptions about Gen Z, as you know, that they're lazy, unmotivated, unwilling to put in the work. 90% of Gen Z says this is the most damaging lie told about them. And from where you sit, what is the most damaging misconception you actually see about Gen Z, and what's true instead?
I definitely think lazy is the number one misconception. I don't think they're lazy. I just think they see that there are different measures of what someone does in the workplace that really reflect on their intelligence, performance, and contribution, and that they're focused on those things. They're not there. I think that like, just let's take a look at a very simple one, like, remote remote work versus, working in office. I think that when companies make the decisions to bring people back to the office and mandate being back to the office, and they've done it in a way that is not really thought through, I think that Gen Z sees that right off the bat because you know, like they recognize the fallacy in presence being equated with progress, and that just being in the office doesn't necessarily mean you're doing better work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that they can build up a sense of resentment for companies that make them do that. And I think it can come off I think it can come off the wrong way. I think some of the other things that are other stereotypes is that they lack resilience. And, I don't think that's necessarily true. I just think that I think they're learning the lessons that it took people like me a lot longer to learn about what is not going to be appreciated, which is not going to sort of get you anywhere. It feels like it's like, you know, there's orange juice from concentrate. Like it feels like they're almost like they have like a very concentrated understanding of what work life is, and they have shortcut. I think that the other thing is people think that that Gen Z doesn't want to pay dues and that they want to skip paying dues. I think what they're sensitive to is inefficiency. I don't know how else to express it. It's like the inefficiencies that grow up in corporate organizations where there's a lot of people and there's only so many promotions to go around. Like I think they see all that, and they react in a very skeptical way, but I don't think it's completely unfounded. I think they know coming in, it's been too much of a trope of the people who, kiss ass, get promotion. I think they've seen all these things. It's happened so many times. Whether they've seen it in sitcoms, it's all been all these things that happen in a corporate environment have been packaged up, put into entertainment, put into to conversations like this, to clips and skits on YouTube. Like there's no you can't hide any of these things that happen anymore. And I think Gen Z is acutely aware of that. And that is what leads to a lot of the misconceptions about
Yeah, no,
who they
I hear
are
your
and why they
perspective. I like the way you're putting it. Let me flash something else up and you can give me a reaction to this. We are forever elsewhere, according to Jonathan Haidt. Gen Z often splits attention between the physical world and the digital life. Always online, a portion of attention is still monitoring their social metaverse. When you see Gen Z behavior that older colleagues misread as disengaged, what do you think is actually driving it? And what would change if people understood that better?
Well, I do think there's some truth in the distracted nature.
Yeah.
I wouldn't put it all on them. I think it's it's certainly something that they've grown up with, so it feels more normal to them, and a little less verboten. I grew up being in meetings where when there were senior executives in the room, like you gave them all your attention. You don't get exposed to them as often as a young person, so you need to make the most of the exposure you have to them in the meeting. I've been in meetings with younger folks and Gen Z folks who are checking their phone when the CEO of the company's in the room, and that, it's something that I wouldn't do. So I do think that that's probably true. I think that I wouldn't turn it into it may be a stereotype, but I think that's how they've grown up. So I think there's truth there to it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
what would
what would you
change if people
change if
understood it
people
better?
yeah,
Yeah,
because
right.
if they have
So
a better understanding of where they're coming from, what can they do to?
yeah. So what I've seen in my experience and what I've worked with as a leader and with the other leaders that I've worked with is to make sure that your folks in Gen Z again are not just in the room for the sake of attendance and being present. Like they should have a role. If you give them a role, if you give them something that they are supposed to do, or something specific that they're supposed to take from the meeting and then follow up on, or if it's a meeting where you specifically want them to contribute, I think they'll be a lot more present. But if they're in the room just because of, they should be so lucky to be in the room, I don't think they react well to that. I think they feel that I don't think they feel like attendance is necessarily enough of a reason to give their attention to something.
You know, I everyone wants a purpose, is what you're saying. They need a purpose, they need a direction, they need a goal. So that's
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I
yeah,
guess I'm thinking about other stereotypes that they only work for causes they believe in. I would say that that's probably a true stereotype, and it's too bad it's not one that the generation can thrive around because I don't
yeah.
I don't think it's a bad thing.
No, it's not. I'm going to show you one more because I think about this a lot. There's a mentor mindset, and David Yeager, a developmental psychologist at UT Austin, found after a decade of research that young people into their mid-20s are wired to read every interaction for signals of respect or dismissal. What they actually need, not rescue, not a lowered bar, but high standards and genuine support held together at the same time. That combination is what Yeager calls the mentor mindset. And compared to, let's say, where you're a subordinate, you're going to be doing what you're told. They're so used to being in school coached and trained and encouraged and all these questions to improve and what am I doing wrong? We do satisfaction surveys, so to speak. So, I mean, if you could give Gen Z one piece of advice to actually succeed in today's system without losing who they are in the process, what would it be?
So, this is very much from personal experience. One of the negative experiences I've had with Gen Z, especially in the work that I've used that I focus on in digital media and innovation. I haven't experienced this in my current work as a fractional CMO, but previously, when I was doing a lot of work in digital innovation, Gen Z reacted negatively to the fact that we were all trying to figure some of these things out together. They really expected the playbook to be handed to them so that they kind of knew what was expected of them and what they're supposed to do specifically. And the fact that the leader didn't have that answer to them, they felt like they were wasting their time. And what it really was, if they really understood what was going on, they were actually given an opportunity to figure something out that the leaders themselves did not know because we were dealing with something new and evolving. And nobody really knew when we were building out the MTA's digital ecosystem. No one really knew what the best use of 10,000 screens in a subway system was for brands and for people. That was the job, was to figure that out. And I think some of the younger folks felt that the fact that we didn't know that answer was a shortcoming of leadership, and it was a negative part of their experience.
So they got critical.
They got critical of it
and
instead
judgmental.
of seeing how cool
And
is it that
threw
I
it
get
out
to,
there.
yeah.
Okay.
Instead of seeing like how cool is it that I get to figure something out with people who have figured other things out before, but not this, And so that would be my piece of advice: is you are either in the job market or entering the job market in a time of incredible change, and there are going to be a lot of people who have hair like me, who you would think know all the answers because they've been doing something like this for 30 years or 25 years, or whatever it is. But the reality is no one's ever actually done something exactly like this because there's all this new technology that's disrupting the industry. And you have an opportunity to be a part of figuring that out from your perspective, which is incredibly valuable as a digital native, as somebody that's, growing up with this technology. You have this role that is, could bring great value if you have the right attitude about it.
So we're back to a mindset. So
Yeah.
you said it earlier. I want to flash just one more thing up here. If we take a look at some of the things that Gen Z, and just take a look at like a ranking and taking a look at their perceptions, I just want to focus on, whether they're fair or unfair. And then, I want to look at the perceptions, which perceptions are most likely to hold Gen Z back, and what proactive steps can they take to address or reframe them for a greater workplace impact. And I'm going to pull it up here. There's a number of different things you mentioned already. What's the top three you think?
So the first two I would say, are lazy, and so K, lazy, and then it's, L, doesn't want to pay dues, or G, skips due paying. And I think that a good leader will understand what's behind these things, and maybe I could say have empathy for it, but at least understand the context in which they might seem lazy or they might seem like they don't want to pay the dues. But I think if you really engage with them on what the root causes of those perceptions are, you'd realize it's what they're really doing, and they may not be able to articulate it this way. What they're really drawn to is efficiency. That's really what they're looking at, is that they find the way business is being done and the way things are structured as inefficient. And that's really where they need help. They need help understanding why things are a certain way. And if you can't explain that, then then I would say they're right. Like at the end of the day, I would say that you are operating in a old convention that is probably in need of disruption, and they can be the catalyst to do that. So I would go lazy, skips due paying, and then only works for causes they believe in. And and I think they all can be damaging if they're not really understood.
So
And I think leaders can play a role in helping to sort of break through these, but I think Gen Z needs to be a little more self-aware and understand why they may seem lazy when what they really is, they don't
yeah,
want to waste time on things.
right, good. No, I hear that, and I can relate to that. So what makes those three areas, if you picked one, what makes this area where they have the greatest ability to create positive change in their future opportunities, relationships, or career success? Or what is the, yeah,
I think lazy. I think they need to focus on that, because I think if you can break through why you don't want to, why you're not excited about doing certain things, and you can articulate it in a way that is related to the end goal that your business, that the business of the business challenge, if you don't see a connection between the things that you're doing and solving the business challenge, that's a smart insight that helps the company. And if somebody, and if you have somebody like that working for you, that's value. That's great value. But if because of these perceptions of stereotypes, it's coming off as lazy, then nobody wins. It's bad for the Gen Z person, it's bad for the boss, it's bad for the company. And the truth is, what you have there is not someone that's lazy, but someone who either doesn't understand, and you need to explain to them why it's important to do a certain thing in a certain way. There's value there. When I
see,
think back to things that I did that, were starting in a business, it was a lot of it was unnecessary. A lot of it was about paying dues. A lot of it was about, getting exposure to other things. The truth is that these days it's very easy, and you can focus on those things. You can do those things. You don't have to, you don't have to waste time to do them in the way they used to be done. Does that make
I,
sense?
I, I absolutely, I think what I find parents doing now, and I see this a lot in my practice, they over explain why. And I think our young kids, even starting early as kindergarten, first grade, second grade, they're so exposed because of devices and on television to many things you and I and other generations have not been exposed to, with current events and being aware of our emotions and how to express ourselves, that they want to know why. And I think when you have a young person who has a more advanced intellectual ability to a degree, right? They're ahead of their years, like an old soul type, or just someone who has a high IQ, very young, but emotionally they might be all over the place, which it goes back and forth. It's a seesaw. Parents tend to treat them like little people,
Mm,
and they're not doing it because I said so. You know, we
right,
sat in meetings and we were listening. Why we here? Because I told you to be here. You look,
right,
learn,
right,
you look, listen, and learn, and keep your mouth shut. No, I'm not saying that that was overtly
right,
said
right,
to us, but I want you to watch and I want you to listen and I want you to learn. I don't want you to speak. You don't speak out in these big meetings. You're lucky to be here.
right,
So here they are. They like this mentor mindset where, well, tell me how we could do this. What do I need to do? Well, tell me what I'm doing good. You're not, all you do is tell me what I'm doing wrong. So you have a deficits model. You don't have like an encourage, so this is where the older generation might be coming across is not connecting. And that's really what somehow is driving some of the things that I'm looking to focus on here. I just want to take one more with regard to the parents now. What is one practical action Gen Z can take to challenge or overcome this perception? And what should parents encourage and reinforce or model to help support that growth? The laziness. You mentioned the laziness.
yeah.
You mentioned some what they could do.
I'm not sure I totally understand the question. Is it about advice for parents?
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
What should
I
parents
definitely
encourage or
I feel like
reinforce?
I should be
Or
giving advice to parents.
no, okay,
I'm
no, I
wrestling
hear you.
I'm wrestling it with enough about it with myself and my own kids. I think that we're all the parents of Gen Z are in the unenviable position of having to prepare kids for a world that
Yeah,
we no idea what it looks like. So I think that is, I think you got to get your kids kind of comfortable with that, right off the bat. That your advice and guidance is broad and general, and that the specifics of what it may be applicable to the experience of what they're going through specifically, but it may not be. And I've been very honest with my kids about that. And maybe I would definitely think I'm guilty of explaining the why, because I've often said, this is why I'm giving you this advice. I'm
right.
giving you this advice because in my life experience, this thing happened, this is what, and so that may happen to you,
No, I appreciate your answer. And there's nothing wrong with explaining the why. What I notice is when a teacher says, take out your notebooks, why? There's no why.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
When someone says, don't go in the street,
Yeah.
and they seem like they're annoyed, why?
Yeah.
Don't touch the oven. Don't open the door to a stranger. Why? Okay, we can answer all those. There are times when I said so and do what I say. There's an emergency, we do it. But there's time to be inquisitive. I think that gets lost. And there's nothing wrong with explaining the whys.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
what tends to happen when you have someone who presents with a more advanced level than what their age really is, they tend to get treated as if they're older, and they're not. And I think what's happening is with devices, kids are learning how to do things much earlier in life. So when our kids are now graduating, they have a good foundational knowledge when they start
Yeah.
working. And
Absolutely.
there's a hard time now for them to somewhat pay their dues because they don't earn it. But I am as effective as that guy who's 35. But why shouldn't I get paid as much? Well, you haven't been working for 15 years or plus,
Right.
whatever. But you just started. But I'm doing the same work. That's their perception oftentimes. I know it's a generalization, but in essence, they feel they're even sometimes better equipped. And there's a learning curve that they believe they should be able to, they want to just bypass that. So
Yeah.
those are the
Yeah.
misconceptions I'm thinking,
Yeah, totally. I mean, one of the best things that I think that kids can have, and I'm very fortunate that both my Gen Zs, I have a Gen Z on the youngest end and one a little older. They both had passions, they both had interests that they focused on and pursued in school, out of school, and they built an understanding of what practice and depth and knowledge and experience means around these things.
That's great.
And I know this because they constantly tell me how little I know about any of these activities. And when I ask a question, it's the dumbest question anyone could have asked. So I think they've built up that sense of expertise, and they know the difference between, a Google search or a Gemini AI report that gives you an overview of something and what it's like to really do a thing. I think that
Yeah,
builds up that
well said.
sense of experience. So I think what you'll start to see is, knowledge is going to become is increasingly cheap. Knowledge is almost anybody's. It's there for anybody to have around any topic, around any subject. You can articulate and sound like an expert. You can address important points. You can sound like anything because of all this technology that's there to help provide that information, but you can't really ever replace experience.
So well said. I appreciate what you're saying. Jason, this has been a genuinely meaningful conversation, and I want to thank you for coming in with the openness that you did. I think what you're modeling here is the willingness to, I am impressed with your willingness to interrogate a path that you already invested in, to give yourself permission to change, and then to keep evolving through every chapter that followed. And this is exactly what this show is about, what I'm looking to explore here with people. And I have to say, there's something that makes complete sense to me about the fact that you started in architecture, because everything you've done since then involves designing systems that hold weight. That early training didn't disappear. It just got repurposed for you. And whether you were building companies, leading teams, or advising founders, there's a through line there that I find really compelling. And so what I'm taking from this conversation is something you said that I want to sit with. There is value in stability, but not stagnation. That's a sentence worth carrying, because I think most of us know the difference on some level. We just don't always give ourselves permission to act on it. I can see how your story really commands the experience that you have. You can really command a room when you're giving the advice or speaking to others. It's just really impressive, because I'm sure people take notice and listen.
Thank you. Yeah, I love mentoring, younger folks. It's my favorite. It's really one of the things that kills me about being an independent operator now is not having teams to build and develop. There's other benefits to it, but I miss having a team to help lead.
I know what you're saying. Yeah. I also want to say I really appreciate the fact that you came into this with no guardrails on the conversation. A lot of people want to manage their story, and the fact that you're willing to just let it breathe says something about, where you are with it. This is very impressive, and it just speaks to how you're willing to take a risk, which is great. Because but you come from a place of confidence when you do that. See, it takes a level of confidence to do that, or trust. You have to start out trusting
to get in touch
and
with
it takes
that
time to get yes.
Yeah.
And that takes, because you're willing to see how things unfold, which is great. And I can see why you're saying you're a very creative guy, because to be in that field, it's creative. And then you went to another field and you just transferred it. And similar to myself, where I started out in the marketing and sales field for a major airline, and then just went into a completely different direction. So I kind of connected on that with you.
To bring to the other.
What you're doing now with Kuperman Advisors is interesting to me, because you're not just a consultant, you're a translator. You take a founder's vision and find the language that makes it land for people who need to believe in it. That's a very particular skill, and it's one that's clearly informed by the experiences you've shared with us today. Again, I want to thank you for joining us here on Pivot Point Strategy for Change.
Thank you for having me, Nick.
And for those who want to get in touch with you or find out more about the work, how can they reach you?
KupermanAdvisors.com. Go to the website. You can learn a little bit more about me and what we do.
Great. So thank you again, Jason. I'm so impressed with your perspective. And should the opportunity come up down the road, I would love to have you back if our paths can cross and we can work something out, which is wonderful to do. Thank you. To everyone listening, thank you for being here. If this conversation resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a review, subscribe wherever you listen. You can find more of the work I do on Substack, nikmichael.substack.com. I'm Nik Michael. This is Pivot Point Strategy for Change. I want to leave you all with the one question I like to ask at the end of every episode. What is your pivot point? What's your pivot point?